Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into some pretty complex stuff, but it's so fascinating and relevant.
Definitely.
We're talking about algorithms
Yeah, yeah.
and even something called
Settler colonial algorithm.
that's right. We're going to be looking at this academic paper. It's called An Unsettling Artificial Intelligence, Algorithms, Curriculum, and Futurities. Have you had a chance to look at this one yet?
Yeah, it's a really interesting paper. It kind of makes you rethink how you see algorithms.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, usually when I think of algorithms, I think like computer code,
Yeah.
like the stuff that makes our phones work or whatever. But
Right, right.
this paper is saying that algorithms are actually much broader than that.
Much broader. It's basically any set of rules or instructions that guides decisions.
Okay. So like a recipe could be considered an algorithm.
Exactly. And so could, like, the steps you take to get ready in the morning. You're following a certain set of rules, a sequence of actions to achieve a desired outcome. And the paper argues that this kind of thinking, this algorithmic thinking, has been shaping our world for centuries, like way before computers even existed.
And that's where this settler colonial algorithm comes in, right?
Yeah, that's the core argument of the paper, that there's this specific algorithm, this way of thinking and acting that's rooted in colonialism
Yeah.
and has had a profound impact on how we understand the world.
Okay, I got to be honest. When I first saw that phrase, settler colonial algorithm,
Uh-huh.
I was like, what? How can colonialism be an algorithm?
It is a little abstract, I know.
Yeah, it's like colonialism is a historical event or a process,
Yeah.
but an algorithm.
Right, but think of it this way. Imagine you're an early European explorer, arriving in a new land, like what we now call Canada, and you start mapping the territory. But these maps, they're not just neutral representations of the land. They're imbued with a particular worldview, a way of seeing the world that ignores indigenous knowledge and presents the land as empty, as terra nullius, ripe for the taking.
So the maps themselves are kind of like a tool to justify colonialism.
Exactly. That's the algorithm at work. And then this mapping algorithm, it kind of gets intertwined with other factors
Like what?
like the devastating impact of European diseases on indigenous populations, the introduction of new agricultural practices, and the concept of private property. All of these things work together to dispossess indigenous peoples of their land and resources.
Wow, I'm already starting to see how this algorithm is much more than just lines on a map. It's this whole way of thinking and acting, a system of power, really.
Right. It's a way of seeing the world and making decisions that has very real consequences.
Mm.
And what's even more crucial to understand is that this algorithm, this way of thinking, didn't just stop back then.
So you're saying that it's still affecting us today?
Absolutely. It's still shaping how we approach things like land rights, environmentalism, even how we think about the climate crisis. We're still operating within this framework in many ways.
Wow, so this paper is really arguing that colonialism is not just a thing of the past. It's this system that's still operating in the background, shaping our world in ways we might not even realize.
That's a powerful argument, and I think it's essential to consider, especially as we move further into the age of AI.
Yeah, speaking of AI, how does that fit into all of this?
Yeah.
Is there a connection between this settler colonial algorithm and the algorithms that are powering all of our technology these days?
Yeah, that's where it gets really interesting. Because the paper argues that a lot of the algorithms that we're building now could be inheriting or even amplifying the biases of this older algorithm.
So we're talking about things like, I've heard about those facial recognition softwares that have been shown to be
Yes.
biased against people of color, or those hiring algorithms that seem to favor certain demographics. Is that what you mean?
Those are some examples for sure. But the paper goes even deeper. It brings up this concept of eugenics, which might seem like a strange connection at first, but
Eugenics. Oh, wow.
it shows how supposedly objective scientific ideas can be really twisted and used to serve a harmful agenda.
Right, eugenics. You're talking about that movement in like the early 20th century that was all about selective breeding and forced sterilizations. And
Exactly. And what's really disturbing is that eugenics was often used to target,
indigenous populations.
to try and control their reproduction and essentially eliminate them. It's a truly dark chapter in history, but the paper uses it to illustrate the real dangers of algorithms, especially when they're built on biased data and assumptions.
Okay, so we've got this settler colonial algorithm shaping how we see the world, and then this idea that it's potentially influencing the development of modern AI.
Yeah.
But where do we go from here? Like, is there any hope for breaking free from these patterns?
Well, that's where the paper introduces this really intriguing concept, Indigenous futurism. And I think this is where things start to shift from feeling like kind of hopeless to feeling more hopeful.
Indigenous futurism. Okay, I'm intrigued. What is that?
It's a way of thinking about the future that draws on Indigenous knowledge and values and stories. It offers alternative possibilities that challenge the dominant, colonial narratives we've been talking about.
So instead of just accepting the way things are, it's about imagining a different kind of future.
Exactly. And the paper looks at this really fascinating example from a novel called The Marrow, Thieves.
Okay, let's talk about that. What's the Marrow Thieves about, and how does it connect to all of this?
So in The Marrow Thieves, it's like this dystopian future where settlers have lost the ability to dream.
Okay.
And they're like desperate. So they're driven to extract bone marrow from indigenous people because
Yeah.
indigenous people are the only ones who can still dream.
Wow, that's a pretty heavy image.
Yeah. And the book uses this as like a metaphor, for the resilience of indigenous knowledge
Okay.
and also this need to like decolonize our thinking.
So the dreams represent something essential that the settlers have lost,
Exactly. Yeah.
and they're trying to like steal it from indigenous people rather than, figure out how to get it back on their own.
Right. It's like,
Yeah.
the paper argues that the book offers like a counter algorithmic way of thinking.
Oh.
Instead of just accepting that logic of the dominant system,
Yeah.
the indigenous characters resist it
Okay.
and they offer different ways of knowing and being.
I'm starting to see how this all ties together now.
Yeah.
Yeah, like we have these historical patterns of colonialism and then this settler colonial algorithm that is, like you said, still operating today.
Mhm.
And then we're talking about how AI could either repeat those patterns or, offer us a different path forward.
Yeah, it's a critical point for sure. And the great thing is this paper doesn't just, leave us in despair.
Right.
It actually offers some pretty concrete ways we can move forward in a more ethical, an equitable way.
Okay, great. So let's get into that. Like, what are some of the solutions or strategies that they suggest?
Well, one of the key things they emphasize is decolonizing our curricula.
Okay.
They argue we need to challenge those like Eurocentric narratives
Yeah.
that have dominated education for, so long.
Mm-hmm.
And instead we need to make space for indigenous knowledge and perspectives.
So it's more than just like, adding a couple books by indigenous authors to a reading list or something.
Yeah, exactly.
It's about fundamentally rethinking how we teach and learn.
Totally, yeah. It's about recognizing there are multiple ways of knowing and being in the world, and we need to start valuing indigenous knowledge systems.
And how does this connect back to AI? Is it that, like, if we decolonize our own thinking, we'll be better at creating AI systems that don't have all these biases?
That's a big part of it, yeah. But they also talk about this idea of data sovereignty, which is, especially important when we talk about research and data collection that involves indigenous communities.
I'm not really familiar with that term, to be honest.
Yeah.
Can you explain what is data sovereignty and why is it important?
Sure. Data sovereignty is basically the right of indigenous peoples to control their own data.
Okay.
So they decide how it's collected, how it's used, how it's shared.
Okay.
It's like a crucial part of self-determination for them.
That makes sense. It's like for so long, research has often been really extractive,
Sure.
especially when it comes to indigenous communities.
For sure.
So data sovereignty is like shifting that power, making sure they have a voice and control over how their information is used.
Exactly. And that's so important when we're talking about AI.
Right.
Because data is the foundation for all of it, right? So
Yeah.
if we want AI that is actually just and equitable,
Yeah.
we have to make sure indigenous communities have control over their own data and a say in how it's used.
Okay, so we've got decolonizing our curricula, recognizing data sovereignty. What else does the paper suggest? What can we do to make sure we have, a more ethical AI future?
They also talk about going beyond just the technical aspects of AI, like we need to engage more with its cultural and, social and ethical dimensions.
Like that theme running through the whole paper.
Yeah.
Like we can't just focus on the technical stuff without thinking about the bigger context.
Yeah, totally.
The historical legacies, how it might impact different communities.
For sure. And this is why I think that Indigenous futurism lens is so valuable. It encourages us to imagine different futures for AI, futures that are grounded in these values of kinship, reciprocity, and respect for the land,
Okay, yeah, I like that. Earlier you mentioned the Marrow Thieves as an example of Indigenous futurism. Can you think of any other examples, like maybe something more directly related to AI?
Yeah, they talk about relational AI, which is kind of this idea that we design AI systems that recognize the interconnectedness of all things
Okay.
and that prioritize, collaboration, mutual benefit, kind of taking inspiration from indigenous values of kinship and reciprocity.
So instead of seeing AI as a tool for like domination or control, it's more about like building relationships and understanding and connection.
Exactly. Imagine AI systems that are designed to actually promote well-being,
Hmm.
to support communities, to help us live in harmony with the natural world.
It's a really compelling vision,
Hmm.
but it also sounds like a pretty big shift from how we usually think about and use AI.
It is a shift, no doubt, but
Yeah.
the paper argues it's a necessary one if we want an AI future that truly benefits everyone.
So it sounds like we're talking about a very different vision for AI than we usually hear about,
Oh, yeah.
right? It's not just about making things faster and more efficient,
Right.
but about like using it to build better relationships with each other and with the planet.
Exactly. Yeah, it's about recognizing that technology and especially AI, it always reflects our values,
Yeah.
the priorities of whoever creates it and uses it.
Right.
And unfortunately, like we were talking about earlier, a lot of AI development is still very much driven by those, colonial extractive mindsets.
Which brings us back to Indigenous futurism then,
Yeah,
right? Using those different values, like kinship and reciprocity and respect for the land to guide how we develop AI.
it's definitely a shift in thinking.
Yeah, it is. It is.
But imagine the potential.
Yeah.
What if instead of just repeating those harmful patterns,
Yeah.
perpetuating inequalities, AI could actually help us create a more just and sustainable world?
It's a beautiful thought, but how do we actually get there? Like, how do we move from these big ideas to actually putting them into practice?
Well, the paper doesn't give us all the answers,
Yeah.
but it does offer some really cool examples. For instance, imagine an AI system that helps us manage natural resources.
Okay.
But instead of maximizing extraction,
Yeah.
it's designed to prioritize sustainability,
Oh,
taking into account the needs of both humans and the environment.
that'd be amazing.
Yeah, or imagine AI in education that helps revitalize indigenous languages.
Okay.
Centers indigenous knowledge systems instead of reinforcing those dominant narratives.
So we're talking about more than just like tweaking the algorithms or something. It's
Yeah.
a completely different approach to designing and using AI.
It is, and like we were saying earlier, it's so important to make sure that indigenous communities have a real voice in this process.
Absolutely, data sovereignty is key.
Yeah, it's not enough to just consult with them after the fact,
Right.
They need to be involved right from the start, shaping the research,
Yeah.
determining how data is collected, making sure that the benefits are shared fairly.
It seems like this whole conversation is really about challenging how we think about progress.
Hmm.
We often think about it in terms of technology, like faster, more efficient, more powerful.
Mhm.
But what if real progress is actually about creating a more just and equitable and sustainable world?
Yeah, I love that.
And what if AI, guided by these indigenous values we've been talking about, could actually help us get there?
That's the question, isn't it? And I think it's one we all need to be asking as we move further into this age of AI.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation for me.
Yeah.
I came into this thinking about algorithms in such a narrow way.
Mm-hmm.
And now I see how it connects to all these bigger issues,
It's all connected.
social and cultural and historical forces.
Definitely.
It's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
But I'm also feeling really hopeful, like there's so much potential here if we can just kind of shift our thinking.
I agree, and I'm glad that more and more people are starting to have these conversations.
So for our listeners out there who are maybe feeling a little overwhelmed by all of this,
Yeah.
like it's a lot, right?
Mm.
The complexities of AI, these legacies of colonialism,
Mm-hmm.
what's the one key takeaway you want them to leave with? What should they do?
Don't be afraid to ask those hard questions,
Right.
Like, think critically about the technology we're using every day.
Mm.
Demand better from the companies and institutions that are building this stuff.
Yeah.
And remember that we all have a role to play in shaping the future.
That's a great message to end on.
Yeah.
So for our listeners who want to learn more, we'll be sure to put some links in the show notes, including a link to the paper we talked about today.
Great.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
This was fun.
It really was, and we hope this has inspired you to think differently about the future we're creating together.
Absolutely.